Greetings, friends. This is Chris Batts, and you are listening to episode number 15 of the Future is Bright podcast. In today's episode, I spoke with Susanne Meline, co-founder of Francis Capital Management. We discussed her time at both Jones Day and then Houlihan Lokey, where she was working with clients in transition and bankruptcy. We discussed her journey to then launch Francis Capital and their investment philosophy. Stay to the end to hear about her numerous board experiences and insights for aspiring board members and so much more. If you haven't already, please subscribe to this podcast and leave a review on iTunes and YouTube. A bit more about Susanne. Susanne co-founded Francis Capital Management, a value-based equity investment advisor focused on small-cap companies over 20 years, where she continues to work as a special situations advisor. She was previously employed as an investment banker with Houlihan Lokey and also practiced law in the corporate group of Jones Day. Susanne serves on several boards, including 3 U.S. public companies, 1 offshore hedge fund, and 1 venture-backed company. She received her law degree from the University of California, Hastings School of Law, and her undergraduate degree from the University of California, LA. Welcome, Susanne, to the Future is Bright podcast. It's great to have you on the show.
I'm glad to be here, Chris. I'm a fan of your podcast. I've learned quite a bit from some of your guests, and I'm happy to contribute to the podcast myself.
Well, thank you for those kind words. I really appreciate it. They make me look good, so I know you're going to do a fan. I'm excited about your story. So I've been kind of very excited when I had a chance to meet you through an introduction of Stuart Hirsch, who connected us, and you shared some really fascinating aspects of your career as I was working on a board search. And so I am looking forward to this today. Let's get rolling with kind of one of those key questions. Let's talk a little bit about maybe some family dynamics and what led you to become going to law school.
The quick answer is that I would argue with my mother when I was a teenager, and she would say things like, wouldn't it be great if somebody paid you to do this and you could monetize the skill set you have to earn a living, which at least planted the seed of going to law school. And so I always knew I wanted to go to graduate school. I learned a lot in undergrad, but I knew the road wasn't finished, and I just didn't know that much about what was available. And so law school seemed like a great choice, and that's where I started out. And obviously I worked as a lawyer, but it's led me to some other things as well.
Right. So you went to University of California, Hastings. You also did University of California, LA for undergrad. But what led you through that process of going to law school, thinking you wanted to be a law clerk, because you were that in the U.S. court system?
Well, that's interesting, because I would say if we sort of talk about certain themes on my resume, sort of transition is a big one. And so when I went into law school, I had an idea that I wanted to be a real estate lawyer. I grew up in Southern California. Real estate's kind of a big part of how a lot of people earn their livings. Yeah. My mother worked in real estate, and so this was just an idea I had. Well, the world had other ideas, because as we all remember, in the late 80s and the early 90s, there was quite a significant recession. You had Drexel Burnham that went bankrupt. You had all those LBOs that everybody thought were a great idea that suddenly didn't seem so great when business dropped off. And then you just had a real estate market that really cratered in Southern California, because this is when you had all the defense contracting firms that were shut down. And so law school really was a tough time for a lot of us in those years. A lot of firms had gone from 40 summer associates to like 5. People got their offers revoked. And so I worked for a real estate law firm that was not going to have any of its summer associates come back, because they were laying off their own people. And so for those lawyers out there, they know how tough it can be if you're in one of those situations. So it required a very fast pivot on my part. And so what I could see from reading the newspaper is that there was a lot of action happening. It just wasn't in the traditional format. It was in bankruptcy court. And so bankruptcy was just starting to be used as a tool for reorganization and for business deals. And this was a new theme. And so I was able to get a judicial clerkship for 2 years, learn some new skills, and really just kind of go back to the starting point and figure out what the next move would be.
Yeah. So after that clerkship, you landed at Jones Day. Why that law firm? There's some dynamic other law firms, and Jones Day is one of the best out there. But, curious why you ended up going with Jones Day.
I was interested in bankruptcy, but I wasn't 100% sure what I wanted to do still. And so Jones Day really had that classic new associate program where you join the firm. They had a training program. You got to rotate through all the different departments. And so I didn't know what I didn't know. And so I wanted that opportunity to see everything. That having been said, once I showed up at Jones Day, I saw something really interesting, which was nobody was interested in bankruptcy. Not one of my new associate group classmates, none of the junior associates were interested in it. It's a big code. People hate tax code. They hate bankruptcy code. And meanwhile, this is like an exploding field, right? Big cases going on. They need to staff people up. And so to me, it seemed like a really good opportunity to maybe stand out and to work in a growing area where there seemed to be a lot of need. So I quickly started working on bankruptcy cases there. And Jones Day is one of the best firms in the country for working on debtor side bankruptcy cases.
They absolutely are. And so you were at Jones Day for 5 years, a little bit more, during 95 to 2000. So you got to see the 2000 boom, all that take off. What kind of clients were you working on while you were at Jones Day?
So Jones Day, I did a lot of big debtor cases, and those are interesting because I could see at the law firm like what the dynamic was. And so I could see that, at the end of the day, you want to be able to bring in business. So this is something I kind of figured out pretty early. And bankruptcy is a little interesting because they're kind of one and done, right? They bring in bankruptcy counsel, and unless it's TWA and they file bankruptcy like 3 times, or some of these repeat people, which there are some, you kind of bring in these big cases and that's kind of it. Whereas I could see some other law firms, like I'm going to use Milbank Tweed as an example, they represented funds. And so the funds would like come back over and over again. And so even though I worked on these big debtor cases, I tried to go work with the corporate department and bring in like my own little clients, tiny little clients. So I was really active socially in LA. I've been on some museum boards and I knew a lot of people. And so I was able to get a few funds to bring their work to Jones Day. And so I had these little fun clients, and then I did this big debtor work. And so that was interesting for 2 reasons. First of all, being the person in charge of delivering the work to the client. I mean, that's just really a personal growth experience that a lot of people don't have until they're much farther along in their career. And also I got to learn about funds, right? How do funds operate? How do they make money? What are their limited liability agreements? Who gets this and who gets that? So that was really valuable for me. Just to round out my experience with both types of work.
So just pausing for a minute and talking about funds. Are we talking mutual funds, hedge funds? What sort of vehicles are we discussing?
These were hedge funds. So, one was a client a fund who kind of had a little bit of a specialty in distressed. Another was just kind of a value opportunistic fund. And a third one was an analyst who worked for the biggest hedge fund in LA, who decided to form a little hedge fund, a little operating entity around basically his personal account and a little bit of outside money so he could start developing his own track record that was separate and apart from the fund that he works for. And so one of the fund manager who ran the distress fund just said like, we need legal skills. So someday if you get some investment banking experience, maybe you could work for a fund.
How serendipitous that comment.
Yes.
So why don't we segue? Please share about that fateful transaction that exposed you to an investment bank.
So for investment banking, that was really serendipitous, and that's kind of a lot of things in my career. So I was working on a bankruptcy case. We had to hire a banker to do a valuation, and one of the bankers just came up to me and said, "You just really seem like an investment banker. You really are interested in the business." I'd taken a lot of classes, Chris. So once I started working on the bankruptcy cases, I really discovered a love of the business. Like, what was wrong with the business? How did they end up in bankruptcy? How are they getting out? Who was going to provide them capital? How is it all going to work? And so I spent a lot of time with the bankers and the financial restructuring group, just trying to understand like the bigger picture of the bankruptcy as opposed to just doing the legal work. And so this particular person had noticed and had said, are you interested in working on the bankruptcy side, but with investment banking as opposed to as a lawyer? And of course, I was very interested. And the thing about Jones Day is the practice was very Midwest centered. So a lot of the deals were in the Midwest. And Jones Day only worked on massive, huge cases, right? So that's kind of limiting. Whereas Houlihan Lokey worked with smaller companies. I mean, by small, we're talking about $1 billion in revenue or under, Stairmaster, stuff like that. So, but that might line up better with some of the work I was going to be able to get maybe I'm never going to be able to bring in, the GM bankruptcy, but maybe I could work more with the smaller companies.
So are you telling me Houlihan Lokey made you an offer?
They did.
Okay.
Yes. So I went to go work for Houlihan Lokey, and that was, it was a risky move, Chris, because I went from being a lawyer where I really knew what, you really kind of know what you're doing by the time you bid at a firm that way, to go to an investment bank where I certainly knew a lot about things that mattered, but there were a lot of things that I really didn't know about. And so that can be a little bit scary.
So I'll backpedal you a little bit. Getting that offer from Houlihan Lokey, was that an easy thing? Walk in the door and they handed it to you? Did you have competition? Did you have your parents or other influences saying, what the heck are you doing? Love to hear that transition for you.
You need a lot of knowledge to get through an investment banking interview. I mean, they are extremely rigorous and they're quite different from lawyer interviews. So basically you'll be sitting down talking to somebody about, some experience, and then all of a sudden they'll say, what's 658 times 32, right? And so just sort of putting you on the spot, can you do mental math? And so that was part of the interview process. So I knew people who had been through it, so I was prepared, but it's quite different from a lawyer interview.
Yeah. Yeah. And how would you, so Jones Day has got a very rigorous, grueling work culture. They expect a lot out of their attorneys. They hire the best in the country. How would you, and then there's the reputation of an investment bank work culture. Would you compare apples and oranges? Are they the same?
I think they're the same. I mean, basically, if you think about both jobs, you're in the service business. You're highly paid to act fast and to get the company through this difficult period of time.
Yep.
So by the time I was at Houlihan, I pulled, a lot of all-nighters because these situations move really fast, which is what makes them so exciting.
Yeah.
That's what makes them fun. But at the same time, you're dealing with kind of melting ice cubes. So every day of delay is a day where things are not getting better. And so it's not for everybody. Let's put it that way.
So another question, sort of sensitive, but just curious to know about your thinking and risk. Did you take a step back going to Houlihan?
Are you talking about, well, it's really interesting. So I'd say another career theme is I always look for the opportunity, sort of not the pay.
Okay.
What's the opportunity? So investment banking overall is probably more lucrative than lawyering, just because at the end of the day, you're going to get a success fee, right? Okay. So they take on risks. So you will get paid kind of a modest amount of money. The firm does. And then if you close the deal and you're successful, you get to partake in, that.
Upside.
So whereas lawyers, you get paid a lot all along, but there's not this big upside at the end. So pay reflects that. So I definitely took a step back in terms of like how I ranked within the firm, which I was really, really wanted, because you always want to go into a situation where you can meet or exceed expectations. Yeah. So I didn't want to go in at a high level and then not be able to deliver or be on par with, whoever my contemporaries were. Yep. So I'd say pay wise, you make more money as a banker, even if you're kind of farther down the food chain. But really I was like, what can I learn at Houlihan? And really investment banking is all about how many deals are you going to work on and how many deals can you get closed? So the amount of experience that I could get at Houlihan in the short term was like unbelievable, because we did so many deals. We got every deal, we closed them. And I got more experience at Houlihan than some of my friends at other banks that were there for, 2 and 3 years.
Yep. I would love for you to share with my audience what life was going on while you're at Houlihan. I know that there is, I think we're attending class, you were learning, you had a family, you had family dynamics with your dad. I'd love for you to just share some of the realities in this transition where you spent a little bit more than a year at Houlihan and what you did after.
Yeah. So by this time, I'm such a Gen Xer. Chris, I think you're a little bit younger than me. But Gen Xers Slightly. Are famous for two things. They're famous for working really, really hard uncomplainingly, and also being what's called the sandwich generation, right? Where you've got your kids and you've got your aging parents all at the same time. And this was something that you have to remember back then. People really didn't talk about this stuff. You just kind of try and hide it and kind of go about your business. But in this period of time, I had a baby. I was pregnant. My dad got early onset Alzheimer's. So I'm literally being crunched in all directions. So when I was on maternity leave at Jones Day, I took a bunch of classes. at UCLA Anderson School through extension because I wanted to just know more about business, and I just didn't take those classes in undergrad. And then I'm at Houlihan running around Chris, 7 months pregnant and not telling anybody, right? Nobody knows I'm pregnant, right? I mean, you could talk to them and they'll be like, Susanne was pregnant. We had no idea. So, I carried a lot of files. But still, I mean, I talk a lot about transitions and working with companies in transition. And there's also been times in my life when I, Susanne Meline, am in transition. And that was one of those periods of time where I had to look around and say, wow, there's some external forces going on here. I need to find the opportunity here and make sure that I'm successful and I make good active decisions and am realistic about, what I can do and what I can't do.
Yeah. And share with my audience. So, I mean, incredible picture you just painted. And head down, working hard, probably not sleeping much, and raising children, bearing children, dynamics with your father. And lo and behold, you make another huge choice, rather exciting one, depending on who you speak with. But please share with my audience what you decided to do after some time at Houlihan.
Yeah, so this is like my riskiest career move to date, but the external forces were also, fairly large. So yeah. I think I mentioned back when I was at Jones Day, I worked with some fun clients. There was 3 of them, and one of them planted the seed like, wow, maybe this is something you could do. Another theme was when I was at Jones Day working at these big companies, I was really interested in where was the control? Where were the big and important decisions being made? I was kind of like, where's the sun, right? And the sun was like the companies and the capital providers. So we, the investment bankers and lawyers, are kind of circling around the outside, yep. But the companies are making the meaningful decisions and the capital providers are taking risks to support those decisions that companies are making. And yep. So I always wanted to figure out how do I get there? Yep. And so at the time, hedge funds were pretty new. I mean, there were hedge funds, but I could see at Houlihan that they were getting more respect. They were showing up on our deals. People were paying more attention to them. They were having more capital. They were better run. And, they're written about in the paper all the time.
They are.
So this is kind of like a rising tide. And so this fund manager that I spoke of that had this small managed account, the small little account that Jones Day, we'd done the work for them. This is 2 years later. There's a track record. It's a good track record. And so this is the time where I'm like, what if we launch a fund? What if we spin this thing out and make a hedge fund? And so this is where I go from being a salaried professional to being a risk taker, because in order to work for this fund, I'm going to get paid in equity. I take an ownership interest, and I'm only going to make money if my investors make money, if the fund makes money. And that's pretty scary. But the great thing about hedge funds is this is a great business model, Chris. So I've seen it from the documents. And so you can be profitable right out of the gate. And so we were profitable right from when we started. And so this is where I did everything. And you're really grateful for your lawyer training, because the thing about being a lawyer is that you don't know everything, but you know how to figure out things that you don't know. Yeah. So that was what I worked on next.
Amazing. Are you able to share a little bit about the fee structure, or how were you a 2 and 20 classic hedge fund, or were you all success fee in your approach?
We are just the basic, and we started earlier. So that 2 and 20 was fancy hedge funds that come later. So we're very old school. Okay. We were set up when 2% was considered to be outrageous. So our fees are a little bit lower than that. But, hedge funds, if you do it right, and you set up a really good compliance and operational structure, it's a scalable business. So you can run 25 million, 50 million, all the way up. And if you do it right, you don't necessarily have to scale up with as many people. It's a very efficient business. So, but we wanted to make sure we set up everything that was best standards. So I spent a lot of time making sure that we kept up with all the big hedge funds.
So Susanne, did you have mentors, or whether dead mentors in books that you were reading or live ones you were interacting with, that inspired you to take that leap? I know you shared one of the clients of the 3 you brought to Jones Day planted a seed, but to get into a hedge fund, obviously you did some service work with them, but what gave you the courage to step out and say, I can do this?
Well, I knew other fund managers, right? I told you that I'm sort of active in the community with the CFA Society. So I saw other funds and I knew other funds. and I could see what their materials look like. And so I was able to just look at other people's stuff and say like, okay, well, how do we make ours look the same? And there's sort of certain documents at the time people had their presentations, they had their one pager. I mean, honestly, Chris, today, a lot of the stuff still looks like pretty similar, right?
Yeah.
So what's your performance? What are your ideas? What are your case studies? Walk us through your process. And we have the same investment philosophy that we've had all the time, which is value with a catalyst.
Okay.
And just walking through live examples of what that looks like. And so I'm the one that had to go from the manager's brain and lay the stuff all out on a piece of paper in a way that people could understand. And then I'm also really aggressive about getting feedback from people, Chris. Like when we get off this podcast, I'm going to say, okay, Chris, what did I do well? What could we do better? And just really having that interchange with people to make sure that we're always learning and always getting better. So I did that with all our client materials and every person that ever came into our fund.
Awesome. So let's talk a little bit. So your investment approach, you mentioned value cap with a catalyst. Or do you do a lot of diversifying? Do you do concentrated positions?
We do concentrated positions because at the end of the day, people are putting money in our fund because they want kind of our best ideas, right? So some people will say like, oh, we'll have a best ideas fund. And we're like, our whole fund is our best ideas fund, right? So we, look for situations where there's asymmetric risk reward. We look for things that are kind of statistically cheap, kind of that old school Warren Buffett value approach, but we're looking for things that are going to change. And so over time, I mean, I'm describing at the beginning of my time at the fund, the first good solid like 5 years, we're just like setting up the infrastructure, the compliance, raising the money, spending a lot of time with that. So I've worn many hats at Francis Capital, and in more recent years, as we grew and we were able to outsource some of that, and it's just a better fund controls to have more kind of outside people helping with some of the stuff. So then I shifted more to the investment side, looking at companies that are in transition that kind of aligns more with my background as a lawyer and as an investment banker, right?
So all investments are in publicly traded companies, not private or real estate or other forms of asset management?
I would say we've done some private companies, but always when there's a path to go public. So maybe we'll be the last round before their IPO.
Okay.
But typically there's a path to being publicly traded.
And do you have any kind of arc to hanging up your hat with this, or shelf life, or what's your thoughts as far as how long you intend to do this?
Well, one transition I started making probably about 5 years ago. So after, kind of doing the infrastructure compliance stuff, then moving on to the investment side, an area that I was always really interested in was sort of like activist investing, number one. And number two, the thing that I spoke earlier in my career, it's like, where's the sun? Like, who's making the decisions that matter? And capital providers are a really important part of a company's success. But at the end of the day, the companies are the ones making the decisions. They're the ones that are building the products. They're the ones that are, hopefully expanding the business so we can all make money. And so investors are really on the outside of that, Chris. You're on the outside looking in. And so you kind of look for the crumbs of information. You talk to the CEO, you listen to the calls, you throw out your ideas, but at the end of the day, they're in charge. And so I wanted to get closer to understanding how this operates and how they work. And so I became really interested in board service. The other thing I could see is that a lot of these smaller companies, some of them will make some of the same mistakes over time. Like capital providers and companies are like a partnership, right? And sometimes companies don't realize that quite as much as they should. And they just don't understand the capital markets. And so sometimes they make repeatable errors because they just don't know. Whereas I can see it because I've been seeing this stuff for 15 years. And so I have this idea that I could help companies succeed better in their capital markets because I could bring to them all the information that I have from being on the buy side. So I became interested in board service and sort of sat on my first board maybe like 5 or 6 years ago now.
So let's go there. I appreciate you bringing that up. My audience is very interested in board service, especially from an attorney's background. What got you on your first board? How did you get on these other boards? And let's also talk about that activist side as well.
Okay. I would say my first board was serendipity, right?
Okay.
Serendipity is a big thing. So I was literally in a coffee shop having coffee, reading the Wall Street Journal, and there was an article about kind of venture capital funding. And we've all seen the statistics that, women have a hard time accessing capital. they would do these studies where they have a man and a woman pitch the same idea, and the man gets the money and the women don't. So there's sort of like a disconnect there. So I'm reading this article, and this other woman sitting there reading the same article, and we just start talking. And to make a long story short, this leads to my first board assignment, because she's involved in a venture capital fund that's all women funders that funds women founded or led businesses. And so one of the businesses that they'd invested in was a fintech company, Chris. And the fintech company was seeking to provide some services to hedge funds, right? And this is a company in transition. They had a slower kind of to market process than they thought. They were running out of capital. And so they needed to switch out a board member. And so I went on this first board, and it was not an easy board assignment. So a lot of people would be like, nope, that sounds pretty tough, not interested. I'm like, wow, transition, difficulty, sign me up. It sounds perfect. So that was the first board that I went on. And again, because of somebody I met in a coffee shop, and that's where I really discovered that having that finance background and that legal background together, that is really, really the spot where it's extremely helpful.
Huge. So let's go there. What do boards look for in considering attorneys for seats?
I would say now that I've been on probably 5 or 6 boards, and I've been involved and conducted a lot of board searches, usually boards are looking for a specific skill set, right? Yeah. Well, first of all, let's talk about the traditional way of getting on boards. The traditional way is the board says, we need to find somebody, we've got our little skills matrix, and we want to find somebody that has X, Y, and Z. That's the traditional way. I would say those traditional board searches, they really look for people that have operations experience. That's where really most of them come up. And if you think about my first board assignment, it was this weird intersection where I was an ops person. I mean, you don't think of a lawyer and a hedge fund person as being an ops person, but I was, Chris, because I had run the operations of a hedge fund, right? Yeah. So in that context, I was the operator and everybody else is the money people. So that was kind of a key bridge for me to make. So any lawyer out there, I think about what their practice area is and how they can tie it to like the operations of a company in some way, right? So like, for example, I talked to like a labor and employment lawyer who really wanted to get on a board. Right. And I was like, okay, think about the type of company where you're going to be like the ops person. So maybe they've got like software they're trying to sell to labor and employment law firms or something where you're involved in that piece of it, right? So I would say other boards that I've gone on, it's because they specifically need somebody with capital markets experience. They're out there raising money, and, you know, investment bankers for small companies, you know, sometimes they're spending more time thinking about their hedge fund clients and what they need and want than what the company wants. So I could really help the company negotiate effectively with the investment banker and help them understand that the terms they're signing up for today, how they might impact them down the line. They're just like, oh, it's just a few warrants. I'm like, yeah, those warrants that you think are no big deal today, they could really hang you up 5 years from now.
Let's clarify a little bit of your board experience. Was it all publicly traded companies? I imagine there was a couple of them that were private. Explain that mix.
So those positions come about in quite different ways. So I've been I'm on one private board right now. I've been on one private board, and I've been on 3 public boards. So private boards, usually it's the funders have a heavy hand in who goes on the seat. I mean, it's usually like venture capitalists who funded the company. So they're filling the seat themselves or picking the person, or the CEO has picked somebody. So in terms of figuring out like how you're going to get in that board seat, it's like, do you know the capital providers, the VC people, or, you know, do you know the founder?
And then in regards to the public, are those ones you've made investments in?
It's been a mix of things. So one of them, I sit on behalf of our fund. So our fund had an investment, and I'm representing Francis Capital. Okay. So another board I'm on, I was put on the board or gently suggested by capital providers, right? Okay. So they wrote another check to the company. This is a company that burns capital, and it was gently suggested that if they wanted another $10 million, that they would like a person to go with the check, and that would be me.
I'm sure that's sometimes can be difficult to be involved. So I imagine some board environments are pleasant, and then other ones are more challenging. You know, Care to share any instances of challenge that you've come across?
Yes. And I would say if people really are interested in board service, like being willing to go on a board where it's challenging is a really great way to get the opportunity. So when I look at these boards, to me, all experience is good. And sometimes the tougher boards you're going to get more experience, and that's going to make you a better better board member. So if you're always just looking for the perfect board, you may be looking for a really long time. So, and lawyers, you have to have the skills to be able to do stuff like that. And I do think that lawyers are going to have the skills to navigate those situations better, just because you really understand, like, what are my fiduciary duties? Who do I work for? What's my job, more than other people? So I wouldn't be shy of, kind of thinking about those situations a little bit differently. I would say, I'm just trying to think of specific examples. I mean, I did go on one board where, the CEO was needed to go, right? I mean, he wasn't going to get the company where he needed to go. And so having seen companies that have not been successful, a lot of them, I'm able to get to that place maybe a little bit faster than most people. And I also know the cost of not moving fast enough. So that's just really, uncomfortable it's just uncomfortable to have a conversation about, well, we need to get a new CEO, and it's a lot of work to go out and find somebody, and it's really scary.
And were you the catalyst to making that transition happen? And did you drive the search for the new CEO?
I was probably the first one to say, are we going to talk about the elephant in the room here?
Okay.
Right. For sure.
Yeah.
But then, you have to do the work. So I had to go out and find the search firm, and, it's a lot of work.
Yeah.
So, but yes.
What were the 1, 2, or 3 key characteristics in the CEO that you put in place?
I think the most important thing for all leaders is just like low ego, right? We all know a lot of things, but there's a lot that we don't know, every single one of us. And so do I have a CEO who knows a lot of important things, but also is willing to learn? And then, of course, it all starts at the top, the tone's at the top. So I, as the lead director, I also have to be low ego. And I know a lot about certain things, Chris, but there's plenty of stuff I don't know. So you really have to have a two-way street where we're collaborating. And it's not like people, if they make a mistake, they look dumb, or if I make a mistake, I look dumb. We all have a lot to learn, and especially with small companies.
That's excellent. I'd love for you to share this list of certificates that you have in your career journey and how that's kind of supplemented your career over time. You've been one of the key people I've interacted with who have put so much effort and focus, or the volume there. And I'd love for you to share with my audience the advantages and the why and how it has served you. If you would care to elaborate.
Yeah. So when I decided that I really kind of wanted to sit on boards, I wanted people to know that I was just really serious about it. And I love saying this, but I'm young to be a board member. I'm just going to say that again. I'm a young board member. And 5 years ago when I started, I was even younger, or maybe 6 years ago. So starting off sitting on boards when you're like in your 40s is, young. And so you have to show people that you're serious. And I also want to really add value once I'm there. So part of it was just an effort to increase my own, confidence and learning. Another was just being responsive. I could see that specialized skills were needed on boards, and I'd look around the boardroom and I'd be like, wow, nobody has this. I better get smart on it. One, obviously, is cybersecurity. So cyber is something that you have a lot of boards that don't have people that have any knowledge, and you're responsible for overseeing it, but yet you don't really know what you're looking at. So I was on more than one board where I could see that nobody had that experience or expertise. And again, I dealt with disaster recovery. I dealt with IT systems at a hedge fund. So it was like a good segue for me to sort of get the certificate and fill that need.
So you went to Carnegie Mellon University and got the certificate of cybersecurity oversight for boards. Was that all done online? Did you have to go in person? How did that work?
It's all online, and it's a collaboration with the National Association of Corporate Directors, who really tries to look ahead and see like what do boards need right now. Nice. And that was an area where every shareholder, everybody wants to know about cyber, and then you have boards that don't have that skill set supposedly overseeing it. Yeah.
I'm going to just share with my audience this list you have here. So you've got a certificate from Harvard on audit committees for board governance, which is fantastic. You went to UCLA, Anderson School of Management. You have a certificate on being a board of director. And you also, Investment Management Due Diligence Association, IMDDA, you have something for hedge fund due diligence. Share that. What's that about?
I love that one. And so I actually sit on the board of a reinsurance company right now. And a reinsurance company, basically, it's a captive / reinsurance. We're basically managing a pool of money that then will then be used to pay out claims like over time.
Yep.
And so as part of that, we're picking fund managers and hopefully generating a greater than expected return on capital, right?
Interesting.
And so having that certificate is super helpful to me because I can make sure that the people who work for this board are doing the right amount of due diligence and I know all the right questions to ask, or I think I do, of the different managers that are taking care of our capital. And then of course the flip side is that I'm also a fund where people are investing in our fund. And so I always wanted to make sure that, we were very excellent. And so, one thing I always work at, I always work with small companies. I have a small hedge fund. It's just because you're small doesn't mean you can't be excellent. And so I really strive to always make sure that we have the best practices and appropriate procedures at my hedge fund, at my small company, that we're really keeping up with everybody else who's bigger.
I love it, Susanne. Question, what advice would you give to my audience and say they've been practicing law in a corporate law firm or in a corporation and they got a crazy hair idea to make a transition like yours, whether it's an investment bank, a completely different industry, little lateral potential, or go start something new? What would you tell them?
I would say, first of all, just look at the environment around whatever this opportunity is. Or if you're trying to find an opportunity, just look at what's happening in the world right now. Right? What are areas of expansion? What are areas of contraction? Where is there shift occurring? Because anytime there's a change or a shift, that's when I think you're going to be most likely to find that new opportunity, right? I'm telling you about, I went into a hedge fund when hedge funds were an area of growth. I had a personal need for a transition. I went into bankruptcy because the corporate environment was changing and there was a need in that area. And then I started sitting on boards and boards that had transitions where, people are coming in and out of the boardroom, they're leaving their board position because of whatever reason. So then there's a spot for me. So I think that's what I would look for. I like to be super well prepared for when those opportunities exist. So I've gone out and get certificates. I take classes. I make sure that I'm really smart. So when opportunity calls, I'm ready to pick up the phone and answer it and be a strong candidate. And the other advice I would have is look at the opportunity, not at the compensation. I mean, to me, the compensation is the last piece. A job should pay you in all kinds of different ways about, the experience you get. At Houlihan, it was how many deals was I going to close? On the boards, it's what am I going to learn? And then the last question is kind of what's the comp? And then hopefully really what's the upside if you do a good job? So that would be my advice.
Yeah, love it. Susanne, how can people find you, contact you, follow you on social media?
I'd say the best way is probably LinkedIn. So I don't have a super active LinkedIn page, but I definitely use that as my way of communicating with people that reach out to me or people that I meet in professional engagements. And then it also gives me a chance to see what they're up to and where we might overlap professionally.
Susanne, it's been an honor and a pleasure. Thank you for your time today.
Thank you so much, Chris. It's been a pleasure for me as well.